Hey everybody, welcome back. Music Corner, as always, host Cade Cunningham. How about him? Today's video, if you couldn't already tell, it's gonna be a long one. A lot of work went into this one. It is the top 50 albums of 2011, a 10-year retrospective on one of my favorite years of the 2010s, and a year that was incredibly influential for me and my personal tastes and growth as an avid music fan and frequent music listener. I love these records. Many of these records I heard around the time they came out, and my opinions on almost all of them have changed in one way or another. There are records I don't like nearly as much that miss this list. There are records I used to not like as much, or maybe hadn't even heard of, that crept their way onto this list. It was an incredibly difficult list to make. I had a much harder time putting these 50 records together than last year's 50 albums of 2010 list. So much so that I even wanted to throw out a couple of honorable mentions at the start of this video before we even get into the bulk of the list. And speaking of the bulk of the list, this one is going to be a long one. It's going to be indulgent, I know. The first half, I'm going to try and get through them as quickly and conveniently as possible before we get into some of the more long-winded explanations that I have for why I love records so much later on in the list. But in the description, I'm going to include a bunch of timestamps linking the way around this whole list. I don't expect or ask anyone to watch this all in one sitting, but yes, watch it in chunks, please. Jump your way around the video. I'm going to include timestamps for that very purpose. So without further ado, I'm going to rattle off 4 honorable mentions that came just short of making the list, but I highly recommend, starting with Kraft Spell's Idle Labor. If you like indie pop, you like dream pop, absolutely check this record out. Also going to give a shout out to Battles with their sophomore album Gloss Drop. Used to love this record. Don't love it quite as much as I once did, but I still think it's really good and worth listening to. Next up is Montana Roberts with the first in her Coin series. This is a really personal, really experimental, really intense jazz record. If that sounds like your thing, you're definitely going to want to check this out. It will knock you on your ass for sure. And finally, the Africa HiTech record, 93 Million Miles. This is an electronic music project that uses African instrumentation and samples, and one half of it is occupied by Mark Pritchard of Global Communication fame, who I love Global Communication. This record's pretty good if that's your thing. So we're going to jump right into the list, kicking it off with number 50, The Kills, with their album Blood Pressure, the 4th from the duo, and another helping of intimate, well-written, mature, well-structured indie rock and alternative rock songs that just about anybody should be able to get into. And at number 49, Ice Age with their short but sweet debut New Brigade. This is a little bit more raw and off-kilter than a lot of what they would go on to do, but if you're a fan of later Ice Age releases, you definitely want to give this thing a shot. Give it a listen. It's really good. At number 48, we've got Bill Callahan with Apocalypse. Once the main brain behind Smog, he started releasing albums under his own name in the 2000s, and this is probably the highest peak of his named solo albums, if not his entire career. Just a really interesting, narratively rich singer-songwriter project that still hits all the right buttons 10 years later. And at number 47, Timber Timbre get slow, creepy, methodical on Creep On, Creepin' On, a really interesting, idiosyncratic, dark rock record. At number 46, Explosions in the Sky give us another helping of their grand post-rock instrumental sound on Take Care, Take Care, Take Care. And at number 45, the Antlers attempt to follow up a modern indie classic and do so pretty well on the upbeat by comparison Burst Apart. At number 44, we get prime mixtape era Pusha T on Fear of God 2, Let Us Pray, another helping of hard-hitting, intimidating, strong-willed, lyrically witty, awesome in-your-face hip-hop from Pusha T. And at number 43, a record I have a bit of a reputation for not liking, but I really do like this record. I do think it's a pretty good record. I think it pales in comparison to what Annie would go on to do after, but I do still have to admit that St. Vincent's Strange Mercy is quite a solid album 10 years out. At number 42, we've got The Field with a beautiful, minimalist little piece of singer-songwriter electronica fusion that I've come to love a lot in the decade since it first came out on the album Looping State of Mind. And at number 41, the original raw Bandcamp version of Car Seat Headrest's Twin Fantasy. If you don't know, they redid this record as a band in 2018 and updated, cleaned up, and modernized the sound. And while I prefer that version of the entire album, this is still a remarkable achievement of songwriting, and there are a number of tracks on here that I love the original versions of and would go out of my way to listen to this version. Easy peasy. First 10 out of the way, and here's where I start to make people angry. Number 40, one of the most acclaimed albums of 2011 from one of indie music's golden bands, Fleet Foxes with Helplessness Blues. While yes, there are some absolutely incredible tracks in this track list, I think it's on the longer side. There are plenty, I'll say a number of songs on here that I can definitely do without. I think it's the weakest of Fleet Fox's 4 records thus far, but there's still so much here that reminds me why I love the band for all of the other great things they've done, and a couple of their best tracks turn up on this album. At number 39, an album that I don't feel like gets the appreciation it should, Julia Holter's Tragedy. And while Julia has become one of the most acclaimed singer-songwriters in the chamber pop, whatever aviary could be classified as, genre, a lot of fans don't tend to go back this far, and I think if more did, they would find that her really rewarding style of songwriting and poise as a vocalist and a songwriter has always been here. The presentation may be a little bit more raw, but the results are just as satisfying. At number 38, Little Dragon get relaxed but mature and groovy and sophisticated on Ritual Union, a great synth pop record that is not going to blow you away with its sonic intensity, but rather lull you into a blissful submission with its nuances. At number 37, we have two of hip-hop's greatest of all time taking a gold-plated victory lap, Kanye West and Jay-Z coming together on Watch the Throne, a glossy, grand, braggadocious hip-hop outing from two MCs who deserve to be this lavish. At number 36, an indie folk record that impresses me to this day with its beautiful, stark, and intimate presentation, the Veronica Falls self-titled album. I think these guys are one of the biggest what-ifs in indie music because this is such a great start, and I really think they could have gone on to make something absolutely incredible with this as sort of a thesis statement. Next up at number 35, we have The Horrors, who much like the Antlers earlier in the list, were trying to follow up a massively acclaimed project in their discography with Primary Colors, and I think they did a little bit better job of it by maintaining the excellent sense of songwriting that made that record so good, but pushing their sounds into new directions, into territory they hadn't dabbled in before, and sort of getting along on the long journey of throwing the generic post-punk label that they were slapped with out the window that has, by 2021, landed them as an industrial goth rock act. Skying is a pretty good record. At number 34, an honest-to-God post-hardcore album. I know not many people were listening to post-hardcore in 2011. I certainly wasn't, but retrospectively, it is really easy to see that what La Dispute did with Wildlife was really, really, really interesting and incredible. The band, from a songwriting standpoint, pins these unpublished stories one after another that are very narrative heavy, emotionally intense, obviously given the post-hardcore style performances that are applied to these stories. This is almost like if you took a 12-minute Mark Kozelek song, squished it down into about 4.5 minutes of fast-paced, intense narrative delivery and instrumental performance, and it just works. The stories are so engaging, the storytelling is just so intense and often so tragic, and there are so many songs on here that before I even remember a riff or a refrain from the track, I'm thinking about the story and the vivid way that it is told. It's just such an interesting crossroads, the kind of thing that you would never normally hear on a record whose optics sort of sound like this, but the band pulls it off really, really well. At number 34, we've got The Pains of Being Pure at Heart with Belong. Now, when you release a record as loved as their self-titled debut, a record that defines the teenage years of so many people who heard it, you sort of get a clout that you're allowed to ride on, but the band absolutely does not do that. They are playing it even riskier, even more aggressive on this record, and the results are these same driving, dreamy indie pop tracks with a little bit of an edge that was never there before, and it will keep you constantly on your toes. At number 42, the debut album from Canadian instrumental and jazz quartet Bad Bad Not Good. This thing is full of rousing performances and renditions of songs we're familiar with, from Joy Division covers to songs from the hip-hop world, the Legend of Zelda soundtrack, and it all swirls together into this collection of songs that are refreshingly performed, dynamic, interesting, and work really, really well together. This thing's lack of availability on streaming services has done it a pretty serious disservice. I think a lot of people who enjoy anything Bad Bad Not Good has ever done should definitely throw it back and check out this record, because it sounds just as interesting and timeless as all of their other material. Just outside the top 30, we've got a record that I know most people would not include on this list. I'm well aware that I enjoy this album a lot more than other people do, and that is Panda Bear with Tomboy. Now, this thing is sandwiched between Person Pitch, which many people consider to be an all-time classic Panda Bear record, and the also pretty acclaimed 2015 record Panda Bear vs. the Grim Reaper. I think a lot of fans see it as an awkward, maybe not a misstep, but just a record that's not nearly on the same quality level. But I would argue that everything that makes Panda Bear's music great and Animal Collective's music great shows up on here. The vocal gymnastics, the psych pop mannerisms, the great songwriting, those tight, incessantly catchy loops. Tomboy has all of that, and it really has it in spades, and I'm just not sure what about this record it is. Maybe the overall quietness and reserved nature of some of its best tracks that scares people off of it, but I think Animal Collective fans would be in the right to give this another go-around, because you may not have been giving it credit for a lot of things that it did really well. At number 30, The Strokes with Angles. They bounce back from a record that I don't love, even though I know that a lot of fans do. I think the time they took off was good for Julian Casablancas to get his electropop solo record out of the way and apply some of that knowledge to the Strokes brand of rock and roll, because there are a ton of tight, grooving, hard-hitting, electro, pop, rock fusion songs on here, but it all sounds so distinctly Strokes, and they do it one track after another with just good songwriting, incredibly fun hooks throughout, and it's just a good record. There's no way around it. At number 29, we have maybe one of the most You Had to Be There albums of 2011. It comes from us courtesy of Woo Life with Go Tell Fire to the Mountains. Now, I know that a lot of people have never heard of this band. If you go back and listen to it, it may not be immediately apparent to you the band's heavy pop style and why it's so engaging to people like me who were around when they first popped up. But there was a mystique about these guys, about how little online presence they had, about how they recorded this album in like an old abandoned church. There was all of these internet myths and urban legends flying around this group that made it really fun to listen to and to anticipate the eventual release of this record. But none of that has as much to do with why I like this album as much as its fusion of dense compositions and often surprisingly intricate instrumentation with catchy, to the point, infectious songwriting. There are catchy refrains all over these songs, and despite some being 5-6 minutes long, they tend to just breeze by because they are so hooky, they are so pleasant, but when you dive into all the details, there's quite a lot going on here, and it makes it a fun record to return to over and over and over again, taking something new from it each time. I know this is a record that would not make most people's best of 2011 list, but I have a bit of a soft spot for the very unique qualities that it offers. At number 28, Andrew Jackson Jihad, or as they are known today, AJJ, with Knife Man, a literal folk, punk, rock, opera concept album that is heavy on storytelling and heavy on rage, but also heavy on rustic instrumentation and very raw, raspy vocal performances. This record is not for everyone, but if you have an appreciation for folk punk or just punk and political music in general, or an appreciation for narrative songwriting like on the Law Dispute record, you're definitely going to find Knife Man to be an interesting and engaging listen at the very least. And at number 27, we have the much easier to swallow self-titled debut from Yuck. This was an indie band that sort of felt like they came with the frame, a diverse cast of characters performing this raw, rocking indie rock sound. And yeah, these songs are catchy, they are driving, they are intense, they are exactly what you would expect from a youthful, edgy indie rock band, and I just can't get enough of it. At number 26, Colin Stetson delivers one of the most cerebral and crazy jazz records I think I've ever heard on New History Warfare Volume 2, Judges. Yes, these songs are recorded in single takes with very little edits or overlays. Yes, the vocals are recorded in this ridiculous 20 mic setup, but the results of these recording gymnastics are an incredibly unique sound. Colin as a performer is so interesting, so jittery and almost unsettling in his performance style, and the compositions often reflect that. The eerie vocals, courtesy of Laurie Anderson among others, are dizzying and dark and grueling and add a ton to how just wild of a roller coaster this album is to listen to. If experimental jazz is your thing, I'm sure you're already familiar with this, and if you're looking to get into it, this would just be throwing yourself into the deep end. At number 25, a crazy blend of indie rock and pop and electronica and African music and Majula era Bjork vocal instrumentation style tune yards with Who Kill. Yes, Mariel and company craft a bunch of jittery, unpredictable, catchy, awesome, weird songs that have these insane, zany, off-the-wall vocals and instrumentals. This thing is unconventional but unmistakably fun from start to finish. At number 24, we have The Roots. Yes, Jimmy Fallon's The Roots, with their second to most recent studio album at the time of recording this, the incredibly underrated Undone. Yes, this thing may not have the singles, the hits, as you would say, that some of the other Roots records do, but it is a rich, enticing, and interesting concept album that plays out in reverse as you listen through the record. It also features a ton of contributions from great artists, namely Sufjan Stevens, who showed up on this thing and had a lot of influence into the character that the narrative follows. So yeah, once again, they fuse conventional old school styles of soul and jazz with contemporary hip-hop and even indie music and indie stylings to create a record that is just strikingly unique, meaningful, worthwhile, engaging, excellent. At number 23, we have the grouper album Alien Observer. This has been a personal favorite for a long time, and it's a record that is hard to classify because it really does have a minimalism that runs so deeply into the core of its instrumental concepts that you could almost call this record ambient, and yet a number of these songs have vocals prominently displayed, but yet the voices almost use as an instrument to help guide the ambient compositions. The peace and the serenity of these songs is rarely ever broken by the vocals, and I just find the subtle, beautiful nuances of this record to be incredibly engaging, on top of the fact that it's such a unique concept. Explaining it is difficult. It really speaks for itself once you hear it, but because this is not conventional ambient music fodder, I think a lot of people who would be huge fans of this record maybe have never given it the chance that it deserves. At number 22, we've got some hard grooving, some rough producing, some dynamic, driving, completely intoxicating post-punk, courtesy of Crystal Stilts with In Love with Oblivion. Yes, this is not the most unique sound you're ever going to hear, and it has gotten even more popular in the decades since Crystal Stilts originally released this record, but don't let that dissuade you from diving into this record and getting lost in its driving, infectious guitar riffing, and great, surprisingly hooky, and instantly memorable songwriting. At number 21, a record that certainly soundtracked my youth in a big way, and one of the albums that I most instantaneously adopted back in 2011, The Vaccines, with What Else Did You Expect from The Vaccines. Back then, I think I loved the band's edgy attitude, young adult lyricism, and English not really giving a fuck mystique. But 10 years later, I love this record for its simple, to the point, catchy songs, for its wonderful, dynamic group performances that support each other in simple but ultimately really meaningful ways. I think the record is full of tracks that evoke sensations of youth and rebellion and fun, and it's hard for me to say that the record needs anything else other than that to make it into the top half of this list. Inside the top 20, we are kicking it off with some transcendental black metal, as it was called in a now infamous essay by Hunter Hunt Hendricks on the Liturgy album Aesthetica. Yes, this thing was controversial. Yes, people attacked Hunter, wondering why she didn't respect metal. But if you're a black metal purist, what's on here is not for you. This is experimental by comparison, indulgent, and vibrant take on a normally very dark and closeted sound. What the band does here does not stop and start with Hunter Hunt Hendricks' really interesting and philosophical approach to songwriting. The instrumental performances all over this record, particularly the drumming, are absolutely enthralling. The compositions here are dynamic, the tracks support each other really well. There are a couple of good experimental and extreme metal records that just fell short of making this list, but there is no denying that on Aesthetica, Liturgy is doing something really special, really unique, and something that is proving to be really timeless. Speaking of timeless, at number 19 we've got Girls with Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and with albums this year coming out in 2021 that I continue to point back towards Girls as being a possible influence towards. It's just amazing that the band in 2 short albums and an EP accomplished everything that they did with this brooding, often winding, compositionally dense and confusing post-punk, punk rock fusion sound. The sort of manic energy that they put on display on some tracks can clash with the slurred and long-winded romancing that can happen on others, but the whole thing is coated in this very dark and sludgy demeanor that makes the entire record feel like it is in perfect harmony with its sadness and darkness, and that sensation is intoxicating. I really enjoy it. This is a record I've been coming back to consistently for a decade, and it seems that I will never get enough of it. At number 18, we are dealing with the Scottish post-rock legends Mogwai, who have a couple of bona fide all-time classic great records under their belt, coming out with the second act of their career, simplifying their grand instrumental and compositional style down into a group of shorter, to-the-point instrumental rock tracks that absolutely kill it on the record Hardcore Will Never Die, But You Will. There's just a lot to love here about the crescendos, the instrumental versatility and energy that the band puts on display. I think post-rock can be difficult for a lot of people to digest, and while this may still be that to a degree, it also sees the band writing some of the most approachable music of their entire career. Not that this is the only Mogwai record of the last decade that you should even be listening to, but it's definitely the best. And if you have an appreciation for post-rock or instrumental rock of any kind, you'll immediately understand why this record is special and why the talent that is clearly behind it is so obviously on display from its very first moments until the very end. At number 17, we have one of many, many, many great hip-hop records we are going to come across in the top half of this list, Shabazz Palaces with Black Up. Yes, this is a weird, kooky, off-kilter take on hip-hop, but I absolutely love it. I think a decade has only shown us that Ishmael Butler was even further ahead of his contemporaries than we first realized. From songs on here that explore race from a macro level to tracks on here that are just instantly so hooky and fun, it hardly even matters what the lyrics are about. Shabazz Palaces proves the versatility that you can put on display on a great hip-hop record by being great songwriters, by having wonderful production, beat choices, arrangements, and obviously great performances and lyricism from Butler. All of this goes together to form a tight, fun, and strikingly unique set of hip-hop songs that still sound experimental and kooky in 2021, which just goes to show how much further we have to go to catch up with Black Up. At number 16, we have, without a hint of irony whatsoever, completely unironically, my 16th favorite album of 2011, Macintosh Plus with Floral Shop. Yes, this thing is kind of a meme these days. Yes, this thing is the blueprint for vaporwave, a genre that in itself is kind of a meme these days. But 10 years out, I am still so impressed that this started it all. You basically have everything that would make all of the vapor whatever and whatever wave genres that would pop up in the next 10 years right here. This is absolutely through and through the blueprint, the heavy use of sampling, the slowed down, the reverb. These songs pop with a fresh, striking originality, even now being so familiar with so many of the original samples that these tracks came from. Sometimes I just want to hear Floral Shop. And as much as I, in 2021, roll my eyes at some vaporwave releases that seem particularly lazy, I've never understood that complaint about Floral Shop. The music on here is borrowed, but it's repurposed in a way that is purposeful and frankly excellent. Here in 2021, I am just as unashamedly blasting Floral Shop as I was when I first heard it on some sketchy, reposted YouTube channel in 2011. At number 15, we have what is, in my opinion, a hip-hop record that gets lost in the cards when you're talking about the numerous high-end rap albums we're going to be going over and have gone over already. Danny Brown with XXX. Yes, Danny would go on to make a not nearly as engaging record after this before returning with one of the great rap albums of the decade, an Atrocity Exhibition. But looking back at XXX, everything Danny would go on to do is foreshadowed on this record, from the wild performance style, the instantly recognizable yelpy high-pitched vocals that he raps with, to the vile, often profane lyricism that he uses in order to express his points. Everything on this record is turned up to 11. The dial of weirdness and in-your-face intensity is turned all the way up, and frankly, I think that's helped the record stand the test of time. I think there's a lot of albums that sound boring after 10 years, and I don't care if it's 1,000 years from now. I can't even imagine a world where XXX will ever sound boring. It's just not gonna happen. And speaking of good hip-hop, at number 14, we've got the record that introduced the world to one of its now darling MCs, Kendrick Lamar, with Section 80. Yes, this thing lacks in some of the rich narrative ties connecting all of the songs together that later Kendrick projects would have, but it still delivers great lyrics, great performances, great production. Kendrick really showed his ability to tie it all together well. And he shows off his versatility. There are songs on this thing like Hold Up that are some of the most fun, loving, and free songs in his entire discography. But there are also tracks in here that deal with race and drugs and sex in the depreciative but thought-provoking ways that Kendrick does so well. Every tool that Kendrick needed to one day go on and make a Good Kid, Mad City, and To Pimp a Butterfly is on display at different points on this record. And I just am floored by how an artist can show up and make something so refreshing, so talented, so well put together, yet still have so much improving to go on to do. It really is just a testament to how amazing Kendrick Lamar is. And at number 13, we have a meme band alert. Because here in 2021, the indie fans, they don't so much love this band. They call them a meme band. They call them Ford commercial music. And some of that is absolutely true. But at number 13 is the Black Keys with El Camino. Yes, this record is not narratively complex. It is not instrumentally or compositionally dense, but what it is to the point rocking. And these guys, they're not going to blow your speakers necessarily, but make no mistake, they are rocking. The blues influences are here in spades, but they are still making music that hits hard enough for alternative radio to be a little bit scared of some of these tracks. No, this thing is not Ice Age, but in terms of rock records, it really is well written. It follows structures and formulas that have been around for a long time, but it does it in a way that is exciting. And while I think a lot of people have soured on this band's music and their sound in retrospect, I actually see it as holding up pretty well, particularly on El Camino. And the meme bands keep coming. Keep them coming. Number 12. Death Grips. But not this Death Grips record, the one before it. Ex-Military. This record is insane. I know all of their records are insane, including this one, but this one is insane in a totally different way. This one is fucking, like, unhinged. Like, 10 years later, I'm still kind of surprised that this thing ever came together in the first place, because it seems like the members of Death Grips were just going wild in a way that is so untamed and unkempt all over this album. But the sound that they created on here is just fucking intense. From the screamed vocals, from the fast delivery, from the insane percussion all over this thing, from the really rich and engaging and indulgent use of samples. There's just not enough I can say about Ex-Military being a beacon of crazy songwriting ideas and ambition. And while 10 years later, I keep saying that I should stop. Well, since this record came out, there have been plenty of people who have taken the extreme hip-hop ideology and ran with it. It's almost like nobody has reached the balls-to-the-wall aggression that Death Grips is coming at this record with. And there's some days that I want to listen to Powers That Be, or The Money Store, or Bottomless Pit, and there's some days that I just want to put on Ex-Military and completely lose my goddamn mind. At number 11, right outside the top 10, we have Nicholas Jar with Space Is Only Noise. This, in comparison with Death Grips, is a more reserved and contemplative record, a micro house album that features often hushed vocals and tight looped vocal refrains from Nicholas Jar, but this thing is so cool. Like, I know that's kind of a cop-out way to describe an album, it's just it sounds cool, but this album sounds cool. The songs here, despite often being quite minimalist, are groovy and fun and interesting, and I can't get enough of them. Nicholas Jar has expanded his sound in so many directions since then, and yet there's something so innately satisfying about what he does here. even though so much of what Nicholas Jar does turns to gold, including the straight-up house music of Against All Logic. But on this record, he's really just doing it different and scaling it back and really getting at the basics of his own interpretation of micro house and doing it with ridiculous poise and ability, and the results are beautiful, driving, memorable, just generally unique, and I love it. We're kicking off the top 10 with a bang in terms of the whisper quiet ambient album, Tim Hecker's Rave Death. Yes, this thing is stark, it is absolutely intimate, but there is also something grand about the compositions and the way that they present themselves here. Avoiding some of the pitfalls of conventional ambient music, Tim Hecker is making something that is remarkably unique and original here on Rave Death. From the subtle, like absolutely microscopically subtle instrumentation that makes its way into these very tight compositions, yet it enacts incredible change. It somehow makes an ambient record keep me on my toes. I'm always in anticipation of what this album is gonna do next. Even though if you weren't really paying attention to it in the forefront of your mind, you could almost make the mistake of thinking there isn't much going on here. It's such a fine line to walk, and yet Tim Hecker makes it look easy, as he always has the right answer. He always has the right sound, the right direction to go in next, and the results are a record I just adore. Coming up at number 9, another record that people don't love, particularly in retrospect. I know that it's really easy to not like this artist's music these days, but it's also hard to deny that Drake really did it with Take Care. This is, to this day, his best, tightest studio album, his best collection of tracks he's ever released, and he did so approaching the top of his game. Not necessarily as a commercial artist, because he's still at the top of his game as a commercial artist, but as a persona, as a confident performer, and as a voice who had meaningful influence and sway into the sound of hip-hop. It doesn't get any better than Take Care. From the number of amazing guests who pop up on this record, it is kind of incredible to see a number of fan favorites and huge highlights be just Drake, from Headlines to Marvin's Room. But don't let that downplay the great performances from The Weeknd, from Kendrick Lamar, from Lil Wayne, from Nicki Minaj, from Andre 3000. This record is a big family group hug of talented people making glitzy pop rap that has aged like a fine wine, even given some of the other music from its title artist maybe hasn't. At number 8, it's another ambient record with another loose concept applied to it. This time it is Oneohtrix Point Never with Replica, the record that introduced a lot of people to Daniel's music and knocked a lot of people's socks off. This really cool interpolation of ambient sounds with Plunderphonics style borrowed pieces of sound from commercial music and from old catalog music almost has the same sensation as staring at an evocative piece of art reflecting on pop culture. Even given that the sounds of this album can be difficult to nail down, the statement feels crystal clear. And that is a really difficult thing to pull off on something as abstract as Replica. And while you wouldn't think this from a record I just described as abstract, this thing sounds like one continuously rewarding, dynamic, engaging experience from start to finish. It is remarkable how it manages to maintain such poise and creativity within the unconventional stylings of its execution. I think it showed off once and for all the talent that One Oh Tricks Point never has, and all of the versatility he would go on to display with everything he's done since then. At number 7, an album that I felt for years was criminally underrated, not getting nearly the attention it deserves, and yet today I see so much discourse considering it to be one of the great dark, progressive, indie, and alternative goth. Yes, this record is really hard to describe. It's almost like dark prog folk, I guess you could say. Giles Corey with Giles Corey. This is one half of Have a Nice Life, who as a duo obviously have their own accomplishments that can stand on. But yes, Giles Corey is a much more rustic and stark take than what Have a Nice Life does with their grandiose intensity. But there isn't any element of the emotional negligence and darkness that you'd expect on a Have a Nice Life record that doesn't show up on Giles Corey. It often just takes an even more nuanced approach to doing so. These compositions are wonderful, and they make for moment after moment after moment of rich explosions of sound and rises in intensity that make you remember why those moments of vast instrumental minimalism were so important to this type of music in the first place. Describing the music on this record in a way that does it justice is very hard because there is quite a bit of versatility also put on display on the album, but in its best moments, it is just riveting in its indulgent darkness. At number 6, we've got The Caretaker with An Empty Bliss Beyond This World. Until very recently, The Caretaker was one of ambient music's best kept secrets. This guy, Leland James Kirby, digs up a crate of old ballroom music samples from the 30s and 40s and turns them into these incredibly painful, nostalgia-evoking set of tracks that just make you reminisce, even though they come from a time that is not necessarily something most of us would be able to even reminisce about. The tangible, dated elements and the creative and sonically distant sound of this album is all it needs to deliver those incredibly rich emotions and sensations that potent nostalgia can be so good at doing. And for an ambient record to impose on its listener such a strong and vivid emotional sensation is really impressive and something only the all-time great records are capable of. And yes, I almost see An Empty Bliss as being in that category, even though the concept may not be as thoroughly explored as The Caretaker would go on to do on Everywhere at the End of Time. It is still so gracious and so instantaneous that there isn't really much I feel I can say about this record that won't immediately be triumphed the moment you first turn it on and hear it for the very first time. At number 5, just barely cracking the top 5, we have a great, sophisticated pop, indie pop album from Dan Bayar and Destroyer. Yes, we're talking Kaput, one of the definitive indie pop albums of the 2010s, and one of the most mature in the way that something like The Pains of Being Pure at Heart bring this youthful, energetic sensation about them. This is mature. It takes its time. It doesn't use any more instrumentation, lyricism, or performance bravado than it has to, and in that reserved nature, it finds beauty and poise on one song after another. These tracks are catchy without ever being in your face. They are memorable without ever being loud or really even that sonically unique. It's just the mark of everyone involved in the album having so much musical prowess that they were able to craft so much more with so much less. And listening through this album is just a textbook example of why maximalism is so unnecessary. They just do so much with what they have, and the quietness of this album is impressive on its own, but compared with how memorable and hooky it is, even while being so reserved, there isn't much ever that I can think of to compare Kaput to. It's really that special. At number 4, we have a record I really don't need to talk all day about. Yes, I could go on all about the Clams Casino instrumentation. I could go on all about the poise in which the rap verses are delivered, how intoxicating the personal style is, but you can really get all of that by just listening to Peso. A$AP Rocky with Live.Love.A AP. For a debut album, this is just amazing. His prowess for cloud rap instrumentals and for those smooth, memorable lyrics and performances. It's amazing that this early on in Rocky's career, he had such a specific idea of exactly what his sound was and executed it to perfection. This thing is smooth, it's slick, it's catchy, it's everything you would want a commercial hip-hop album to be, and I think it is one of the best in that regard of the entire decade. Man, was it hard picking between 2 and 3. We are dealing with the top 3 being among probably my top 10 favorite albums of this entire decade, and while 1 was easy, 2 and 3 were really, really hard. But ultimately, because the number 3 record sort of lacks a definitive concept linking it all together, I had to put at number 3 The Weeknd's debut mixtape, House of Balloons. Rarely is it so easy to look back on a project and see that made it so influential just being worn on its sleeve. Nothing that Abel does on this album is secret, nothing is hidden from view, nothing is particularly difficult to unravel, and yet within House of Balloons, we see the blueprint for the next decade of R&B. And while The Weeknd has continued to go on and alter his sound repeatedly, this mesmerizing, dark, entrancing take on R&B has completely dominated the genre since House of Balloons was originally released. The songs on here, the sampling, the performances, everything that Abel and company deliver works perfectly to paint this picture of forlorn love, gritty nightclubs, scandalous women, and lots and lots and lots of drugs. And while none of that is necessarily a narrative concept, it feels like a day in the life of its narrator in a way that so many copycat R&B records feel so detached. This one feels so genuine. And while for many people this is not the definitive Weeknd project, particularly after the Quite Good After Hours was released, to me there is nothing that comes even close to the insane accomplishment Abel achieved by putting all of these tracks together onto this record that work so well, that reinforce each other so well, that paint such a vivid picture of who Abel was at the time, while also being sonically incredibly groundbreaking groundbreaking, and ultimately incredibly influential. There is not enough good stuff I can say about House of Balloons. And at number 2, we have a synth pop album, we have a double album, we have a concept album, of course, M83 with Hurry Up, We're Dreaming. Basically, this band's introduction to the world of pop music via the single Midnight City, as well as via a couple of other songs on the record, Turning Up, This, There, and the Other Places. But this is a band who was coming off a decade of amazing material, 3 straight remarkable albums, and when it was time for them to interpolate the songwriting techniques and sonic characteristics of pure pop music into their sound, they did so without skipping a beat. This record has all of the expansive synth passages, gorgeous, beautiful vocal lines, and rich array of songwriting and instrumentation that all of their other albums do, and yet it does it with this glossy, infectious pop veneer, one catchy refrain after another, one memorable song after another throughout, over and over and over again. The way the 2 discs mirror each other, the way the narrator tells stories across this album, it's just so great. And yes, while some people throw this record out as being a couple great singles and the rest of it, I really implore anyone who likes any type of music that sounds like this to jump into Hurry Up, We're Dreaming. Give yourself to it, and I promise you, it will reward you. So, for any longtime readers or viewers, I fear that my number 1 album of 2011 will come as no surprise to you. It comes from an artist who I have consistently dished out mountains of critical acclaim to, and I called it my 2nd favorite album of the entire decade just last year when I did my 2010s decade-long retrospective list, and that is, of course, the self-titled James Blake debut album. Yes, I am of the opinion that this thing is an absolute masterpiece. From the rest of this list, it is no secret that I love electronica, that I love minimalism, and James Blake's singer-songwriter and R&B infused approach to those genres is so gripping. The silence on this record, because it is composed so well and part of such gracious and stark compositions, the literal silence on this album is intoxicating. That is how good of a songwriter and performer you're dealing with when you listen to James Blake's music. Yes, his raw vocals are beautiful, but his deeply altered vocals can be just as striking in their moments of absurdity. And normally when you say absurdity on a singer-songwriter record, you're talking about something that sounds bad. But on this record, there are numerous points where James Blake goes out of his way to make something that sounds crazy or zany or incredibly bold, and yet he does it so well that it's seamlessly interpolated into the beauty that the rest of this album delivers. I know that music that is glitchy, that is this reserved, can often be a huge challenge for people to overcome, and yet everyone that I've ever seen listen to this record is willing to indulge with it and see its best, most accessible moments for exactly what they are, which helps you appreciate its most jagged and experimental cuts. I could talk all day about every individual piece of vocals, every stark synth line, every cascading wave of sound that flushes in from one side of a song to another, every little glitchy vocal manipulation, and every pinpoint, perfectly placed sample that make this record such a masterpiece. But like many of these other albums, it speaks for itself, and in everything that makes it so sonically rich and diverse and groundbreaking, you will find exactly what makes it my favorite album of 2011. So there we go, my voice is fading. I've been talking for the better part of an hour now, and I'm ready to go to bed. Thank you for watching as always. I'll be back with a recap soon. I may do another discography rank video of a high profile band that's been in the news recently. And as far as this series goes, I will be back in September with my top 50 songs of 2011 video, and man, that is going to be a really tough list. It may even have some more honorable mentions than this one, but thank you for watching if you made it all the way through, and I'll be back with some more stuff soon. See you there.